We're going to now do conference panel 2. So I hand it over to the
moderator.
The moderator.
No, I'm dual mic'd. You can see everyone's bio on this panel by looking at your sheet. It's a very distinguished panel, and we'll save some time by getting right into it. Our first speaker is Nick Eberstadt, and he's got slides.
Can I use this?
You want this one?
I mean, I don't care. Whatever is better for the committee. I am. Thank you all very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you especially to Cecilia Joy Perez and Reed Dickerson for helping me pull together the death by PowerPoint that you're about to experience. I am keenly aware that the reputation of demographers is like being actuaries, but without the personality. So I will try to make this as painless as I can. The apologia pro sua vita here is that demographics is one of the very few areas that with reasonable accuracy allows you to look at the future, and what the future world is going to look like. And the reason, try this. This way? Yes. And so, you can read faster than I can talk. The reason that demography allows us to peer a little bit into the future is because the overwhelming majority of people, let's say, who are going to be in the world in 2040 are already alive. Almost all of the workers in 2040 are already born. Absolutely all of the pensioners in 2040 are already born. And if we kind of look at this future population profile and connect the dots backwards to today, we can sometimes learn a few things that can even be useful or interesting. So I could probably stop the whole thing after the next slide. But if you want to do the picture and 1,000 words thing, this one shows you what the population structure of South Korea looked like in 1960. That's the blue and red thing. And the transparent thing imposed on top of it is the population structure 50 years later. This is South Korea over the course of its economic ascent from poverty to affluence. Okay, that's it. And if you want to see what South Korea looks like more or less today versus notional future, 2040, that's the ghost of Christmas future. Just take a look at it, okay? And we'll go through this stuff as painlessly as possible. So birth, death, and migration, that's what this game is all about. The huge change is the collapse of birth rates, not just in South Korea, all around the developed world, in much of the third world as well, but double big time in South Korea. Birth levels, if kept constant, which they never do, patterns don't always hold for the future, are at about a little less than 1.2 births per woman per lifetime in South Korea. Stack that against roughly 2.1 births per woman, which is necessary for population stability or replacement, and you'll see there's a big gap. And the big gap is, we can talk about in terms of net reproduction rates. South Korea is about 40% below the level that would be needed to replace its current population, its rising cohorts, which is to say that for every 100 women of childbearing ages today, there'll be 57, 58, 60 women from the next generation to replace them. I mean, you do that for a while and you change the world, right? We don't know how low birth rates can go. That's one of the many things that demographers don't know. You take a look at the latest, lowest, and you say that's how low it can go. And then when it goes lower 10 years later, you say, oh, that's how low it can go. We don't know. What we do know is that the drop in birth rates in South Korea is across all social classes. There are some places in the world where less educated people have a bunch more kids than more educated people. That's not South Korea. That's old-timey South Korea. This is a head count of total births in South Korea from 1961 to the present. In 1970, there were more than 1 million children born. In 2016, the provisional figures are about 400,000. So total head count of births is down about 60% over this period of time. And as I say, we don't know exactly where it's going, but we have a guess. Same thing happening in Japan, in Taiwan, in other places in East Asia. And that will be relevant in a moment. I'll try to show you why. There are differences from one region to the next in South Korea, but they're all really low fertility levels. The winner is Seoul. Seoul's birth level is less than 1 birth per woman per lifetime at this point. I'll skip over this one. Then there's mortality. This is a really good story. South Korea has enjoyed a health explosion over the last 2 generations. And I may not feel quite so such unalloyed joy about this part of it myself as an American, but South Korea's life expectancy is now higher than the life expectancy of the US. It's an ongoing, continuing revolution in health in South Korea. It's a tremendous blessing and benefit. And the good thing is, so far, there are no limits to improvements in life expectancy anywhere in the world. There are a lot of very eminent people over the last 75 years who have embarrassed themselves by saying that life expectancy can't go any higher than 70. I meant 75. I meant 80. I meant 85. The fascinating thing is, if you look at the healthiest country in the world at different periods of time, it's almost a straight line up for 170 years. So we haven't seen any limits to health improvement for humanity yet. Immigration is a fix for some countries, for some demographic problems, not really for South Korea. About 4% of the workforce is from people born in other countries, China mainly, Vietnam, some others. South Korea is now having a small population of new Koreans, I guess we'd call them, people who are children of international and Korean parentage. It's stabilized at about 5% of total births. So it's going to be a new component in the population, but this isn't Canada. I mean, this isn't the USA. Unless some world-shattering changes occur, I think that there will probably be more of this in the future at this rather low level. So when I was a boy and learning demography, they taught you about how many people there were, how old they were, and whether they were male or female, if it was possible to tell. Now, there are new things which we can discern from demographic statistics, and some of these I think are relevant to Korea's future prospects. One of these has to do with education. This is a population structure pyramid showing age, sex, and educational status. And as I'm sure you've guessed, that kind of like the hollow red thing in the center means no education. That's for the year 1970. The dark blue things on the fringes mean university education. This is South Korea in 1970. Look at the education revolution. This is 2015. Where'd all the red go? And look at the dark blue. That's university education. And look at this. Look at the projections for 2040. Yeah. So there may be fewer babies coming down the pipeline, but they're likely to be much more educated, much more potentially productive, much more healthy. In terms of mean years of schooling for the adult population or for the 15-plus population, South Korea has been catching up with the United States over the last half century. And actually, if you look at the 20-somethings, South Korea is now exceeding the US in terms of mean years of schooling. Here's another way of looking at that. This is just, this is tertiary, this is university schooling. And you can see that the USA has got a lot of, compared to other countries, the USA has a lot of college education for its 20-somethings, but not as much as the ROK. Some of this is education hell, but some of this is real learning that's taking place and the real advantage. The other thing that's going on in East Asia that doesn't come in the head count is the flight from marriage and the revolution in family structure. All through East Asia, young women are postponing marriage to later and later ages. Or not getting married at all, more likely to get divorced and separated. The old Asian traditional family values thing has been overtaken by events. And that's true in South Korea too, although South Korea is not the leader of the pack. Japan is the leader of the pack. This is the ratio of marriages to divorces, and you can see the ratio of marriages to divorces has come down a lot because there are a lot more divorces. Or to put it in a more charming way, this is the marriages versus deaths. And actually, we just had crossover in South Korea. Now there are more deaths each year than marriages. It's a changing situation. One of the things which is also happening is the rise of childlessness. Childlessness used to be involuntary. Increasingly, it is a voluntary phenomenon, and it is a very East Asian phenomenon. South Korea is behind Hong Kong and Japan, and even a little bit behind Taiwan, but there's no uncertainty which direction this is going in. Okay, so what are we in for? Crossover between deaths and births. South Korea is on track to become a net mortality society in about 10 years. Decline in the working age population, that started already. Conventionally defined working age population. Another glimpse of that. The big drop-off is in the young blood, the fresh talent. And of course, aging. What makes for aged societies is lack of babies, and we were just talking about lack of babies. So that is why South Korea's median age has already exceeded the US and is heading up towards Japan and Italy and Germany in the Olympiad of oldsters. And that was interesting. I don't know quite what happened there. Sorry about that. See if I can get this thing back here. And same thing's happening with the percentage of people over 65. South Korea is on track to have over 30% of its population 65 or older within a generation. Stick around and watch. Okay, so some of the implications. Of course, when you have a rapidly aging society, you've got more social demands for budgeting. The proportion of working age population starting like Nowsville is plunging, and what you don't see is the proportion of retired population prospectively rising. To make that all the more fun, we've got this revolution in the family which I was mentioning. Japan's the pioneer, but it's just the pioneer for now. Where Japan is now, South Korea will be. A 20-something woman in Japan now has less than even odds of getting married and staying married to age 50. A 20-something woman in Japan has less than even odds of having grandchildren. This, too, is coming to your town. And in what we can see in South Korea from their demographic data is the rapid increase in the proportion of household heads who were never married. These are people in their 30s, 40s, 50s. This is what it looks like for guys. This is what it looks like for girls. Atomized people are harder to help with social policy and a lot more expensive. And all the more if the situation is that atomized people are living by themselves. The proportion of one-person households in South Korea is set to rise and not to stop rising in our lifetimes. And let me just mention the word Alzheimer's, okay? Alzheimer's, until we find the magic pill for Alzheimer's, it's a very, very, very expensive affliction, and it's very, very, very age-specific. Okay, so, yeah, these are the projections for the burden of Alzheimer's in South Korea. You don't need to pay attention to the numbers; you just see the trend. Okay, so another thing. Let's talk about national security. So male babies eventually become military-age babies, or grown-ups, if they are. And you can see, once again, in over 500,000 baby boys in 1970, barely 200,000 baby boys today. What does that tell you? One thing it tells me is that the utility of South Korea and Japan to the United States has been going down in concert with the proportion of military manpower to that of U.S. But there's something else as well. Yeah. Sorry. Thing is not behaving as well as it might. The other thing is, in an aging constitutional democracy, there are unlimited demands for social spending. And in the race between social spending and military spending, social spending won out in South Korea just a few years after the advent of constitutional democracy. Expect more of the same. And by the way, when I talk about social spending, I'm not talking about all social welfare spending. I'm not talking about education. I'm not talking about health. This is just transfers. This is just like government transfers. So it's happened in all the other affluent democracies. Why shouldn't it happen in South Korea? Reunification. When I was a boy, I was taught that there were twice as many people in South Korea as in North Korea. If you believe the projections that are being done by the UN and other places, that's not really going to be so. In 2040, there will be just about the same number of 18-year-olds in North Korea as in South Korea. That's a very different world. Likewise, if you want to look at the fresh blood in the economy, the 20-somethings and the 30-somethings, there's a big difference between the size of the South Korean and North Korean population as best we can estimate about North Korea for today. It's not going to be very big in the future. It's getting down towards like 1-to-1 on current trends. And for those 1-to-1s, there is an enormous gap in health and in education and skills. I'm using the rotten estimates of infant mortality from the Census Bureau. It's not Census Bureau's fault. I think it's the North Koreans who do the falsification. But it still emphasizes the chasm between North and South in health. If you look at North Korea's own census materials, they admit that they don't have as many years of educational attainment, years trapped in school, as the South does. But the skills are a chasm of difference on top of the educational gap. So these are all things to bear in mind. Finally, demography isn't exactly destiny. Human beings have agency, and governments can make policies and can prepare for things. I'm going to skip over this slide because I think, in interest of time, it's a little too complicated to explain briefly. But what we can say is that South Korea has options. South Korea's labor force participation rate could be higher. The labor force participation rate could be higher. South Koreans stay in the labor force longer if they're in it than people in other rich countries. That's good habits, especially for a longevity-rich society. South Korea is doing very well in knowledge production. It's number 7 in the world in the ratio of patents to people. And if you look at another way of showing that, this is probably South Korea is one of those red dots in the upper right hand of the chart. They're not only producing a lot of knowledge, patents, per university educated person, They're punching above their weight. They're above the international norms that are shown by that regression lines. The South Koreans doing some things very, very right in getting ready for this new world. And the best thing that South Korea could do is to get even more rich. Money solves a lot of problems. And you can see ROK there on this global wealth creation chart. Back in the year 2000, South Korea had about $1.5 trillion. Between Tangun and 2000, South Korea had accumulated about $1.5 trillion. Now South Korea's got over $6 trillion, one of the fastest wealth accumulating societies in the world. And final slide, you can see that South Korea has caught up with those two lines at the top. Those are Germany and Japan. South Korea is doing extremely well in wealth creation. What I think probably South Korea as a society, an economy, and a polity needs to do is not to wreck a good thing, because we're on a very good track right now. Thank you very much.
Next, we'll have Troy Stangaroni. We'll move from demographics to missile defense.
All right. Well, good afternoon. I hope everyone hasn't had food coma slip in yet. I'll be talking about a significantly different topic from Nick, but one that, I think it's something that I've found very interesting for a series of reasons. I don't know how many of you all have followed sort of the debate over the deployment of THAAD into South Korea. Before North Korea had conducted their then fourth nuclear test and done a satellite launch, if I remember correctly, Bruce Klingner, one of my colleagues, used to say that South Korea had 3 no's on THAAD. We haven't been asked, we haven't talked about it, and another one which I forget, but he had 3 no's. So in essence, THAAD was this sort of issue that wasn't an issue. And then Kim Jong-un changed everything. And the thing that was interesting about it was, if you look at this from just sort of a sort of dispassionate perspective, North Korea is advancing its programs. It has declared its intention to potentially use those programs clearly on multiple occasions. It would only seem, rational that the United States and South Korea and Japan as well would all take steps to countermand those steps that North Korea takes. So, somewhat fairly, straightforward, process. Interestingly, I can't remember, it was only like a day or two after Park Geun-hye at the time had said that she was going to consider the deployment of THAAD, that the Chinese ambassador came out and essentially said that this would destroy the relationship between South Korea and China. And I think I actually went into Kyle's office that day. But my first reaction was that, this clearly was an ambassador going beyond his brief. Like, no one in Beijing could clearly have authorized him to say that, this will end the relationship. But if we look at how things have progressed since then, looking back now, I'm not necessarily 100% sure that perhaps that he wasn't instructed to say those specific words, perhaps. And there's a few reasons that I think, I'll get into that, because THAAD, its deployment, and the question of, in essence, what China is or isn't doing, I think is one that is behind, in many ways, a great deal of fog, in the sense that there are a lot of things over the last 9 months or so that I have seen discussed that some of which have been very much on point, some of which have been not on point. But there's this sort of large perception of what's going on and what it means. So before, though, I get into that, I want to sort of talk a little bit about the economic relationship between China and South Korea. And the reason I want to talk about that is because for China to use economic leverage, or as I sometimes colloquially like to call them, non-sanctioned sanctions, you have to have some kind of economic leverage. And the thing that's interesting about the relationship between China and South Korea is that they only normalized relations 25 years ago, and that'll be in this August. So we're not quite till 25 years yet. But as the Cold War was coming to an end, trade between the two, even before things were normalized, it started to pick up. You had a situation to where China has gone from, in essence, doing a small amount of trade over 25 years to now doing more trade than the United States and Japan do with South Korea combined. But there's an interesting thing about all of this, which is that if you ever hear someone discuss the economic relationship between China and South Korea, they'll all say China's South Korea's biggest trading partner. And if you look at the headline numbers, that's true. Right now you're talking about 230, 240, $billion in trade a year. It's gone down a little bit in recent years, not because of THAAD, but there's this very, very large economic relationship. But there's a catch to this economic relationship. And that catch is that 55% or so of South Korea's trade with China is processing trade. So South Korean firms are sending goods to China. Those goods are being assembled with other parts there or parts from other countries. And then those goods are being shipped on to third countries. A colleague of mine at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy about 5 years ago or so had gone through and basically equivalized the end destination trade. And because the processing side hasn't changed that much, I'm guessing these numbers are probably still fairly accurate. And if you look at it in terms of end destination for South Korean goods, the trade with the United States, Japan, the European Union, and China is all roughly equivalent for South Korea. So when we talk about who is the most important South Korean trading partner, well, they're all fairly equivalent. China has a unique role. It's a platform for production, but it is not necessarily important because it is the end destination. It's important because it's the entryway, if you will. And so when we look at how this relationship has grown, one of the things that is interesting about this as well is that, if you were to talk to anyone in the United States, one of our big concerns with China is that we have a significant trade deficit. South Korea is one of the few countries that it's the reverse. They have a significant trade surplus. Now, not only does South Korea have a significant trade surplus, but if you look at this in terms of foreign direct investment, South Korea is the about fifth largest investor, basically behind Taiwan, Hong Kong, all makes sense, Japan, and I think one other country who I'm forgetting at the moment. But they are one of the key foreign direct investors in China. Their investment is actually larger than the United States. So this is a significant relationship that they've invested in. China, on the other hand, only has about, $5 billion or so in stock investment in South Korea. So it's a much smaller investment relationship on the Chinese side. So now what we have is we have this large economic relationship, one which takes and provides Beijing some leverage, specifically because you have high levels of investment in China, and also because even if the final destination isn't China, you still have this sort of carry-on. Though Beijing has to be careful because if you interrupt, supply lines to other countries, then you start drawing other people into your economic warfare. So there are constraints that are structurally in place for what China can do. So, if that's the economic relationship, one in which, has grown now to a point to where China has an FTA with South Korea as well, and one that not nearly as good as the EU FTA or the Chorus FTA, but that is a decent FTA by Chinese standards. You have a situation now to where the question becomes, all right, so why has that been such a controversial decision? Well, there's a couple different ways to look at this, and I think the reality is there's probably only a few people in Beijing who know the real answer. But if we look at the THAAD system itself, yes, the range of the radar does reach into China. That being said, the U.S. has other intelligence assets which can, review the same area, so it doesn't necessarily change U.S. intelligence gathering capabilities if you believe that it's being used for that. If you talk to people who know how these systems work, they'll tell you that in order to target basically the potential of a North Korean missile launch, that you can't really peer into China, so this becomes somewhat irrelevant. If you look at this in terms of where China's ICBMs are and where its other ballistic missiles are, the only missiles that THAAD could potentially track and really intercept would be those that are targeted at South Korea. So if China is thinking of attacking South Korea sometime in the future, yes, that would be a difficulty. But largely speaking, the system itself doesn't necessarily infringe as much on Beijing's security interests as publicly, at least, they're making out. Now, that being said, there is some degree of some people I've talked to that if you look at the THAAD system in terms of how it would be futurely integrated into a broader missile defense system, that initial data from the THAAD radar, then combined with future data, would provide slight advance notice to the United States and its allies in case of a Chinese missile launch. So there might be, a small, trilateral benefit, if you will. But, like I said, essentially, THAAD doesn't really infringe upon China. Now, so the question then becomes, if it's not, a security relationship in terms of the direct impact, what is the broader issue at play here? Well, first, if we think about this in a broader context, you have a situation to where Xi Jinping had come to power shortly before Park Geun-hye. Park Geun-hye and Xi Jinping invested a significant amount in improving relations between China and South Korea. Park Geun-hye was someone who, I find this actually interesting. There was an article the other day that described Moon Jae-in as a president China could work with and someone who would be better. But if you go back to when Park Geun-hye first came into power, and you can set aside whatever one's beliefs about Park Geun-hye are now, Park Geun-hye was someone who the Chinese were praising. She was in essence a princeling like Xi Jinping and some of the other Chinese leaders. She had taught herself Mandarin. She had affinity for Chinese culture. Everything was great. Xi Jinping had called her an old friend. So you have this burgeoning, friendship. So much so that there were often concerns on the Japanese side that South Korea was tilting towards China. And this was probably only reinforced by the tension over the comfort woman issue. So you had a situation to where you have this growing potential relationship between the two countries. Park Geun-hye was the only Western leader to go to the World War II commemorations held in Beijing. She was given a seat of honor just next to Xi Jinping's wife and not that far from Vladimir Putin. So, in theory, if you look at this relationship, it's a good relationship. And I think the difficulty here is that South Korea and China had differing perspectives on where they thought this relationship was going and what they were hoping to get out of it. And THAAD essentially bursted many of those perceptions and preconceptions. From the South Korean perspective, clearly there are probably two things in mind. One is to continue to build what they saw as a fruitful economic relationship, but two, also to take and find a way to encourage Beijing to take and be more cooperative with South Korea in terms of taking and getting North Korea to rein in its programs and to come on board with things. Now, on the flip side, Xi Jinping probably felt that as he improved relations with South Korea, that perhaps he could and start pulling South Korea slightly further away from the United States and perhaps not end, but loosen the ties of the relationship and create more questions. And then if you put this in the context of that, it's been fairly clear from the way he's acted that Xi Jinping has a great disdain for Kim Jong-un. The two have not met, and there seems to be no intention for them to meet anytime soon. You have this situation to where you have a growing relationship with South Korea, their traditional partner they're distancing themselves from, and now you have the situation to where this missile defense system is thrown into all of it. And it shows that South Korea is going to only go into a closer relationship with the United States rather than one with Beijing. And so some of this is probably from misperceptions of where the relationship was going. Some of this is probably perspectives on what the system will do, and some of this is probably also concerns about long-run implications of whether you might someday have a trilateral missile defense system using also sea-based interceptors and radar that would take and potentially then significantly impact China's missile defenses. So whether it's all of these, whether it's part of these, there's something else going on here. Now, then the question becomes, what really has China done? And there was an article that came out early in the year that described China's actions over THAAD has essentially, what was the phrase? The biggest story of 2017 that no one is talking about. Well, a lot of people have been talking about it, so I kind of found that perplexing. And, clearly the impeachment going on in South Korea was a bigger story. But it is interesting in how this is a narrative that has sort of been driven. And at the time, I would have broken things up into essentially three categories. Those things we're fairly certain China is doing and that are related to THAAD. Those things that China might be doing that are related to THAAD. And those things that people think China is doing because of THAAD, but China isn't really doing. And I'll give you an example of the last one, which is now in a different category. China is the largest supplier of tourists to South Korea, significantly so. It's about, if I remember correctly, I think around 50% of the tourists to South Korea are from China. There were a lot of concerns and discussions last year, early this year, about how Chinese tourists were not going and China was putting a ban in place on tourism in South Korea. Here's the funny thing. If you go and you look at the monthly data, because Visit Korea actually does a really good job of putting up all the tourist entries into South Korea, what you'll find is that, in essence, you have a situation to where tourism was still growing from China. It was just growing at a slower rate. So, maybe Beijing's doing a little bit to discourage, but, there's also no way to know that there aren't other factors at play for why tourism isn't growing at as quick as a rate as in the past. So I found the tourism one to be really questionable that there's anything going on. Now, that being said, you get to early March, the story comes out that, there has been this sort of verbal guidance to Chinese tourist companies to end all the tourism packages. They come off the websites. And then you look at the tourism numbers, you have in the first week where it goes into place around March 15th, about a 47% drop. Then if you get into April, which is the first full month that we have data for, the drop is 67%. I find it highly unlikely that suddenly everyone in China decided not to go to South Korea all at the same time. So, this feels like, given the other circumstances, that it's clearly related. Also, an interesting side note, I looked back, and if you go to July of 2015, which is about the height of the MERS outbreak in South Korea, tourism was down 63% from China. Now, you can argue whether the 4% difference is really statistically significant or not, but just looking at it on the surface, one might say that the Chinese were more afraid of THAAD than they were of MERS. Or as Kyle noted, well, they're more afraid of the state than they are of MERS. So, clearly there's something going on now in tourism, but that wasn't the case early on. In the paper I put together, and because I'm short on time, I'll just kind of briefly go through. There's a series of different cases I look at. If you look at things like cosmetics, which people have been concerned about, you have a situation to where actually a lot of the exports in cosmetics have been up. So I think, it's not likely there. You have a situation to where if you look at the Hallyu stuff, they've been taken down, but they have precluded new material from being put up. This is probably likely going on and probably related to THAAD. If you look at the visa issue in terms of different, K-pop stars and Hallyu stars, this has been something where there's a significant amount, so something's clearly going on, but it's not been across the board. And I've also talked to some people who said that some of this has to do with China actually enforcing certain regulations in the past that they had let slide. So you probably have a situation to where China is taking and using greater enforcement to make a point, but isn't necessarily going beyond what they can do. But the other thing that's interesting, if you look at the things that China has targeted, things like the distribution of digital material, things like tourism, they also tend to be things that when you look at China's WTO obligations or China's obligations under the Korea-China FTA, it's very difficult for South Korea to have any recourse on these issues. So they've chosen high-profile issues. They've chosen things that would directly relate to South Korea that people would understand. And they've chosen things that might be difficult, even if there was solid evidence to take and do anything specifically under international trade rules on. And so what I think we're seeing is something to where, because goods trade, services trade is hard to get numbers on, this year is up between South Korea and China. What it appears that China is actually trying to do is to create a climate of fear in South Korea to where you have a situation that There's significant angst in South Korea, even if it doesn't affect overall trade, and it's specific targets that will be clearly identified that people will know. Because let's be honest, if some random company was shut down that wasn't famous, nobody would really know or care. So real quick, and there's some things I was going to talk about, but Kyle will get into a lot of them, so I'll just leave them for Kyle. But I want to just point out that there's a difficulty here in that one of the things that South Korea needs to look at is how to improve international trade rules to prevent this from happening in the future. You know, TPP, I want to be clear, because China wasn't a partner to it, would not have helped South Korea in this situation. But some of the rules in TPP, if they were to have propagated beyond TPP itself, or if China were to join at some point, would make some of these situations more difficult for Beijing to do. It wouldn't necessarily preclude everything, but it would make this more difficult in the future. But the challenge for South Korea is not just simply should they join TPP and try to help push stronger rules internationally, but is that now we have a situation to where the U.S. administration has withdrawn from TPP. It's potentially going to weaken international trade rules, as it would prefer to do bilateral rather than multilateral rules. And also, and I'll just sort of end on this, one of my concerns is there's a Section 232 case going on to where they're looking at using national security as a reason for taking and placing restrictions on steel imports. If we move in this direction of using national security as a reason to restrict trade, it will only make this type of situation with China probably more likely in the future rather than less. Thank you.
Our final presenter is Kyle Farrier.
Thank you. And Troy, that was a really great segue into my presentation, and it really helped to lay out a lot of the underlying specifics that I don't really get an opportunity to talk about in the limited time I have on stage. So please keep Troy's points in mind as I go through my presentation. But before I start, would first like to thank Dr. Bruce Bechdahl and ICKS for inviting me to participate in this year's conference. I've been on this stage dozens of times, but this is actually my first time as a presenter, so thank you, ICKS, for this opportunity. The paper I am working on presents the case for Korea to join the TPP, which is admittedly not an entirely new argument. Questions about whether Korea should join go back several years, and the case for Korea to join the TPP 11 has been made recently by Troy and by AEI's Claude Barfield. But I attempt to add value to this ongoing conversation by framing this argument within a shifting liberal international order. So I would like to start my presentation as I started my paper by rejecting the too often used proverb as Korea is a shrimp between whales. The context of the great power rivalry in which Korea finds itself today is much different from when the shrimp and whales proverb was first written. South Korea is no longer the geographically destined to be the front lines in the Sino-Japanese power struggle, whereas its predecessors were. South Korea today is not a small power. Its rise is largely tied to the establishment of the post-World War II international liberal order, through which it derives derives a lot of its power from today. Although interdependence with the United States and China has increased as a consequence, thereby granting each greater potential leverage over Korea, as Troy had mentioned. Korea is by no means powerless to shape its destiny or even the competition between these global powers. And this is really important for the Moon administration to understand, given the context in which the United States and China are shifting their influence within the region. So the recent developments in the bilateral relationships with the United States and China will likely merit most of Moon Jae-in's attention, but it is really imperative for his administration to understand how these developments fit within the larger picture, within the larger international framework. The emergence of new issues in bilateral relations under the U.S. and Trump are symptomatic of Washington's reversal of its long-standing commitment to uphold the liberal international order. Noting this, specifically citing the U.S. withdrawal from the TPP, Financial Times columnist Martin Wolf asks, will what takes place, the place of a U.S.-backed economic liberalism in Asia be chaos or an order led by China? And to be honest, for Korea, neither one of these options is tolerable. While the liberal order was constructed to accommodate the rise and fall of great powers through the shared benefits of a rules-based system, it is unclear if Beijing is willing to take the mantle. And even if it were, based on its approach to the regional economic integration, China seems unlikely to do so in a manner consistent with many current international norms. How regionalism is advanced may not be the most may not only be the most critical economic consideration for South Korea, but also the most strategic, given the implications for one, the global liberal order, from which much of its strength is derived, and two, the extent to which Beijing can influence Seoul. So it is thus vital for the core interests of South Korea, for the Moon administration to uphold the values the United States has turned its back on by balancing against China. And the most viable way to accomplish this would be to join the TPP-11. So the rest of my paper the rest of my presentation is going to follow the structure of my paper, which is one, how the liberal order is a source of strength for Korea; two, how the Trump administration is a challenge to that source of strength; three, what would a China order look like for South Korea; four, how the confluence of these factors pose a major challenge for Korea; and five, how the TPP-11 is the solution. So first off, the U.S.-led international order can be traced back to the 1940s. In the mid-1940s, its purpose to prevent the reemergence of the devastating previous conflicts, and doing so through increased interdependence, where the interdependence may not have prevented wars previously, arguably contributing to their start, and most obviously World War I. The post-war system, the key difference would be funneling cooperation through new rules-based multilateral institutions designed to maximize ambitious interstate cooperation, the flip side of which was also to increase the costs of defecting from the system. Though over the years an increasingly complex global economy outgrew many of the original functions of these institutions, countries saw the utility of the core values which they advanced and sought to advance them further by adapting these institutions and creating complementary ones. Despite the general decline in the U.S. share of global GDP from the mid-1950s through 2016, Washington was no less critical in advancing the liberal order due to the engendered absolute gains the system brought, as well as it inherently being a projection of American values. U.S. presidents also recognized that to advance the economic well-being of its allies was to advance its own security interests and vice versa. You see this early on with the Marshall Plan to build up Europe, and you see this even more recently after the Cold War through the creation of a network of FTAs, and Ash Carter calling the TPP as strategically important as an aircraft carrier is perhaps the most obvious nod to this in recent times. It was within this global environmental framework that South Korea was able to thrive. Security ties by itself may have played an important role in helping to keep Korea off its feet after the war, but its strength since is built primarily on its ability to maneuver in the U.S.-led international order. Decades of government policy promoting export-led industrialization, resulting in Korea's economic strength, were only made possible by the international trade liberalization promoted from the 1950s onwards. Perhaps the most stark reflection of this is if you were to look today at how South Korea has benefited from the liberal order comparatively to North Korea, you don't really necessarily have as clear a contrast as you do with South Korea and North. And the South obviously was a key player and later on and benefited earlier on in the liberal order, whereas North Korea did not take anywhere near a similar path. Now, this is not to say that Seoul's reliance on the international liberal order is not without its risks. Liberalization in finance led to the 97-98 financial crisis, and today has built an economic structure that is about 50% dependent on exports for GDP, though it is difficult to argue the risks outweigh the rewards. But however, Trump's foreign policy undermines the future of the U.S. leadership of the liberal order, thus undermining the continued benefits of the system and widening Korea's exposure to the risks through its structural dependence on trade. So the America First foreign policy is predicated on zero-sum outlook, which Trump perceives leading both the United States and the liberal order in many ways as antithetical, best represented by his recent quote, "I was elected to lead the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris." So while his predecessors accepted that advancing security and economic ties did not come at the expense of the other, Trump has decoupled the two by suggesting allies have used military alliances to take advantage of the U.S. economically. This change of thinking has massive repercussions beyond bilateral ties, as increasingly ambitious FTAs with allies and like-minded countries have been the key driving forces of international trade standards over the past 2 decades. The first victim of this is the TPP. To compensate would-be trading partners for the lost security benefits, For the agreement, the administration claimed its plan to increase U.S. naval presence in the region as a balance against China will, quote, assure our allies that the United States remains committed in the long term to its traditional role as a guarantor of the liberal order in Asia. Yet, from concerns raised recently at the Shangri-La dialogue earlier this month, U.S. allies seem much less assured than the administration might have hoped. This is hardly surprising, as the shift in U.S. policy favoring bilateralism is a venue for protectionism and fundamentally clashes with the shared economic interests of market economies in Asia, and making them more susceptible to influence from China. Xi Jinping has made his intentions to fill the leadership vacuum quite clear, but the underlying norms in China's two regional economic initiatives are not in Korea's long-term interests. The first initiative is RCEP. Although it was bogged down for the first few years, originally intended to be concluded by 2015, RCEP negotiations have taken a shot in the arm when U.S. pulled out of TPP in January. The deal's sole focus on market access and tariff elimination has been challenged by members of both TPP and RCEP, who are looking to bring more high-quality rules into the TPP, from TPP into RCEP, but China and India have shown no interest in these additions, and India seems even reluctant to even concede on levels of tariff reductions, posing a big threat to whether or not the talks will be concluded. The second initiative is Belt and Road, One Belt, One Road, whatever the name is these days, distancing itself from how the U.S. traditionally supported the liberal order. Beijing has framed One Belt, One Road as win-win cooperation through partnerships and not alliances. However, this does not necessarily mean these partnerships are neither strategic nor are they relatively one-sided. The intended economic growth brought on by One Belt, One Road projects ultimately a means to which Beijing hopes to meet its broader national goals of political and social stability, both at home and with its neighbors, with the idea of its neighbors being that if a separatist movement could spark a similar movement at home, and destabilize the state, which is the ultimate prerogative of Beijing. And it may also be opening new markets, but is almost systematically imposing conditions on partner countries to prop up its state-owned enterprises, cutting down on domestic overcapacity through directing capital abroad. Essentially, China is employing mercantilism to further its position as the center of regional economic gravity. This is made all the more troubling by Beijing's willingness to leverage its economic weight for political gain in One Belt, One Road, as evidenced by its efforts to win over Southeast Asian countries on the South China Sea by tying promises of aid through One Belt, One Road. President Xi has also been quick to take advantage of Trump's election by touting One Belt, One Road as anti-protectionist. But what he is offering is hardly an acceptable alternative, particularly dependent on liberalism as Korea. So what did the confluence of all these factors mean for Seoul? Though RCEP would still be a boon for the economy, with the government estimating it would increase GDP by 1.2 to 1.75% over the next 10 years, the operational question for Korea and for most countries engaged in trade negotiations is not will we benefit, but will we benefit enough? And as our South Korea export base specializes in high quality and technology intensive products and is growing increasingly dependent on 21st century areas such as digital economy, high-quality rules, particularly those governing intellectual property rights, are necessary to ensure that the continued competitiveness of the Korean economy. Looking further down the road, if RCEP is concluded without the TPP, the low-quality rules of RCEP would likely form the sole foundation for the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, that China is looking to pursue. Yet you don't have to look so far down the road to see potential issues with RCEP stemming from bilateral trade dependence with China. By design, RCEP would further integrate the economies of South Korea and China, yet in the absence of strong rules, this would only enhance Beijing's potential scope to politically influence the Korean economy. Korea, as well as Japan, has not featured within the One Belt, One Road framework. I think it was mentioned earlier, is looking to increase the development of the periphery in China, yet it is, which was more focused on Central Asia and Southeast Asia. But how how Korea and Japan might be incorporated could present a significant challenge for relations with the U.S. So Beijing's retaliation over THAAD emphasizes that its core interest in the peninsula is the limitation of U.S. influence. And although there was hope initially that the Moon administration would be able to work out a deal to both satisfy China and the U.S., it does not currently seem like Beijing is willing to change its stance. While I have not seen any indication of this currently being considered, and this is just me looking at the potential geopolitical shifts and corresponding shifts in incentives that this would cause, it is certainly conceivable that Beijing could attempt to switch from employing sticks over THAAD to carrots by attempting to connect Korea to One Belt, One Road, similar to the maneuvering it used with the Philippines in relation to the South China Sea ruling. This obviously would have been unthinkable under the previous administrations, but as the U.S. pulls out of its regional leadership role, President Trump questions the state of bilateral economic ties, and his comments in the alliance raise public concerns in South Korea. Such an offer would now be more tempting, particularly as much of the ruling Democratic Party base in Korea seems to be more open to engagement with Pyongyang should a land route be on the table, and now that Japan is looking to gain access to the One Belt, One Road maritime corridors. So why is TPP 11 the solution? Well, with the underlying sources of South Korea's strength challenged by both the U.S. and China, the Moon administration must look to advance the liberal order without the help from the U.S. to balance against China. Economic incentives currently being pursued, while helpful, are not enough. Building a stronger domestic economy by itself, while certainly necessary for an array of social issues, as well as to decrease dependence on trade dependence to therefore decrease the potential scope for other economies to exert leverage over Korea, it is intrinsically limited, especially as it is dwarfed by other large economies in the region, particularly the 1.3 billion people in China, and its own demographic issues, as Dr. Ebersot had mentioned earlier. So realistically speaking, trade will continue to be a major portion of the economic growth for Korea. And there is no reason for Seoul to not seek access to larger markets in the region and around the world. As such, large, high-quality trade agreements are necessary, yet none of the FTAs Korea is currently negotiating are large enough or have strong enough rules. The best option for Korea moving forward is the TPP-11. Although the combined GDP of the TPP members country dropped from 40% of global GDP to around 12.5% when the U.S. left, it is still large enough and of high enough quality. It would not only create gains through trade, but it would also catalyze a shift in the domestic Korean economy to be towards a more productive, servants-oriented domestic economy through adhering to the rules of the TPP. Although the combined GDP of the TPP-11 is also less than RCEP and even that of China alone, it would also provide a framework to bring the U.S. back into the fold should it be so inclined after the Trump presidency, particularly as Washington continues to see the benefits of TPP rules applied elsewhere, notably as they are working to apply them in the renegotiation of NAFTA. Whether the U.S. eventually rejoins or not, a successful TPP would also force China to bridge the agreement with RCEP in creating an FTAP. Just to be clear, TPP and now the TPP-11 are not designed to contain or even encircle China, but rather to encourage China to adopt norms aligned with the liberal order, which would help to ensure its peaceful rise. So momentum now seems to be shifting away from RCEP and towards TPP. The deal seemed dead in January and February, but since March has gained new life as advanced economies in both deals are seemingly unwilling to sacrifice high-quality standards. In these new circumstances, Korea is not the marginal player it might have been if it had joined under U.S. leadership, and a decision from Seoul to join the agreement would greatly build on that momentum. Joining will greatly build on the current momentum. Joining now would also not be as onerous as entering a completely new FTA, as KORUS is essentially the foundation of the deal. So to conclude, with so much at stake for Korea in the short, medium to long term, the Moon administration must realize it's not a powerless shrimp and still has room to maneuver in the great power context if it moves quickly and strategically. The best move forward for now for Moon is to join TPP-11. Thank you.
We now have three discussants in addition to the three presenters. You'll notice that there's a misprint in your brochure. The three discussants are William Brown, Doug Strazen, and Bill Newcomb. We'll go in that order, and I have to keep them strictly to 10 minutes each so that we can take questions from the audience afterwards.
Okay, please stop me at 10 minutes because I don't want to. I can go on and on if you're not careful. These are all my friends, so given that, I'm going to be brutal. I'm going to be brutal, right? Exactly. Spark a little discussion and maybe a little bit I like to be a little provocative here, so don't take it personally, right? So with Nick, well, I love demography too. The demography, when you're doing a potential GDP outlook for anybody, you're struggling to put in little parameters, and the one that you love to be able to put in is the working age population. That's kind of anchored in, it's already happened, It'll be 16 years, as Nick aptly demonstrated. That's all cooked already in the books. But I also love economics, and actually Nick is a pretty decent economist as well, I think, right? I would say his presentation could use a little bit more economics. And what I mean by that is people adjust. That's what economics is all about. People adjusting, their companies and their governments all adjusting to the world around them. So even though we can project out all these quite accurately, we don't know how people are going to react to them. And that, to me, is for right now, for us in this room now, is the more interesting thing. We know the demographics. We've been looking at it for years. So how is Korea adjusting to this, what now is probably a 10, 20-year-old story, right? And by that, let me just offer a couple of observations. I took off for about 6 weeks a few years ago and traveled by train through Japan, Korea, and China, a wonderful trip. And what I was reflecting on as going on this train, 100, 200 miles an hour through Japanese rice paddies, how incredibly populated Japan is. See, when I went through there, Japan was at the very peak of its population for 1,000 years. Korea now is at the peak of its population. And in all my lecturing on Japanese, Korean, Chinese economies, I don't think I've paid enough attention to the current situation right now where these are incredibly densely populated countries, right? We know that's going to decline, but right now it's heavily populated. So what does that mean? Well, that means, of course, there's not much immigration. Well, I was sort of thinking, well, immigration would solve the working age population. Well, not now. I mean, they're fill-up countries, all of them. Another big aspects of it are finance, of course. If you're looking in the future, how are Korean families reacting to finance? We know that they're great savers, but increasingly we've heard that they're also great debtors, that they've taken out a lot of credit card debt. So what's quite going on there? I'm not quite sure. And then lastly, just to throw it out, is there any indication of an uptick in babies? Kind of, that's usually in economics. There's a reaction to the phenomena, and you might argue a reaction would be more babies. Now, I've been looking for that to happen in Japan, and it hadn't happened in Japan. Maybe it's not going to happen in Korea. But it's the kind of thing I think we should be very observant of, looking at the current, right now, what's going on. Now, on Troy's paper on THAAD, I'm almost inclined, I kind of agree with most of what he says. I'm almost inclined to say, so what? I think the THAAD issue, to me, the Chinese role in it certainly is not so what. But it's so perplexing, and I don't want to say the Chinese are being irrational about it, because I know they're not. China is a huge, complicated country. Some people want this, some people want that. Whatever comes out may look irrational, but I'm sure it's rational to somebody. It's just I haven't figured out who in China is in favor of these crazy attack on the THAAD business. I'm a little worried that it might be a very conservative line, pro-North Korea line, but maybe that's just a last gasp effort of a pro-North Korea line. And I think it's also useful for us to remember China is not near as much as we want, is pressuring North Korea as well. It has not sold any military equipment to North Korea in, 25, 30 years. That is crippling North Korea's conventional military. And there's no indication that they're going to. If there's one thing that we would really not like to see is China upping the ante with air defense stuff going into North Korea. They're not even talking about that. So we have to be a little careful. China, to me, is playing a very nuanced role with regard to North Korea. And maybe this THAAD business plays something in it. But the retaliation, the economic stuff, I just kind of say, so what? So, South Korea, you have a tendency to think a little country like the shark, what do you say, shrimp among whales? I'm going to say a shark among octopi. Think that one through. The tentacles of China, the tentacles of the United States, and then the shark of Korea eating at it. That's the way I look at it. How does that work?
Better than shrimp among whales.
Korea has plenty of ways to, underneath, upset Chinese anything. One example might be the Samsung phone I've got, Galaxy phone. They're mostly put together by Foxconn, that also makes Apple. Foxconn has 1 million workers in China. It's a Taiwan firm. There are 10s or 20s or 30,000 Taiwanese managers of these plants in China working for Samsung and for Apple. In an instant, Foxconn could move to India. China knows that. 1 million Chinese would be out of work. Wow. That's way bigger than we give. In other words, Korean businesses have tons of leverage in China. So don't let them talk you otherwise. Now for Kyle's paper, and it relates a little bit to y'all end on the same note, I noticed. And it's a note that I this TPP business. I must admit, I'm a free market guy, I always have been. I've never been enamored with TPP, and you might wonder why. I think it's the process. To me, the process has been so secretive. I have not been trusting of the TPP process. I still don't know what it says. I never see anybody talking about what it says. It's all these strategic Asia pivot stuff, right? Well, give me a break. I want to know what's in the deal that makes it so wonderful to Washington pundits like you all, right? I'm kind of at a loss. I'm not necessarily against it. I'm not against it. I just don't know what's in it and what's so great about it for especially Korea, which was not in it in the first place. So this idea that Korea can join something that it was not in because the U.S. has left it, I'm scratching my head. I'm just not seeing that. Now, one thing I do agree with you quite, and we probably come together at the end, this idea that Korea needs to get away from too much dependence on China and too much on the United States and broaden its horizons. It's actually doing pretty well with that. I think this idea of the liberal order, or the rules-based, I think it's also not my understanding of the system. My understanding of the system is the Washington Consensus, where what was the big thing? The big thing was the WTO. WTO is a non-discriminatory system where you don't discriminate among countries. Quite the opposite is a FTA kind of system, reciprocity, where you treat people the same, right? You treat us just. Both are relevant in the real world. They always have been. But the WTO, I think most of us older economists really liked because it brought down with bilateral negotiations, brought down overall tariff rates. That stopped with the last great thing, and it was a great thing when China joined the WTO. That was a huge, wonderful thing to happen. WTO has been dead in the water ever since, especially in the last 8 years. So nothing on WTO, everything about this really cockamamie kind of TPP. I don't understand it, right? So as Trump wants to do bilaterals? Yes, absolutely. Korea has been doing bilaterals. All these FTAs are bilaterals. What's wrong with doing a bilateral? I would say Korea has two big bilateral issues. Three, sorry. One, it has to work with our administration here on updating the chorus. All these things, you make a rule, things change, you got to change it. So it always needs to be adjusted. I would argue, grab a hold of the TPP rules and maybe pull them into the U.S. to the U.S. Korea. Two more short things. One is Japan. You don't mention Japan. Japan there's this incredible anomaly of Japan and Korea right next to each other, two of the biggest trading countries in the world. The two of the four big car companies and countries in the world, they don't trade cars with each other. Come on, give me a break. Something's got to happen between Korea and Japan, or, you know. The other thing, of course, is China. And again, it's cars. China has a 25% tariff on cars. It's no wonder Hyundai moves its plants, and Ford and everybody moves their plants to China. It's outrageous if you think about it. It's outrageous for the workers, the auto workers in Korea, Japan, and in the United States. It's wonderful for the companies. That's where we have to be really careful of looking at these bilateral deals. Okay, that's enough.
Well, Tony, you won't have any trouble holding me to 10 minutes. And I tend to think that perhaps the most useful thing I could do is just ask William to continue talking. But I think that my biggest takeaway from this discussion is how little we have heard about North Korea. And I'm not saying that we should have. I'm saying that Americans, perhaps outside of this room, figuratively at least, tend to think of the Korean Peninsula primarily in bilateral terms, that is, bilateral between the two Koreas, rather than thinking of it as in broader geopolitical context. And what is clear from this panel is that whatever analogy, whatever ichthyological analogy one wishes to apply to the Republic of Korea, it is mobile and it has teeth. We could argue shark or barracuda, and I would say, this is a conference in Korean studies. Perhaps the Korean studies framework needs to change somewhat to think of the Republic of Korea in global terms, as a state of global significance, rather than as a state of regional significance. That in 30 years ago or 40 years ago, with regard to South Asia, you talk about the Indo-Pak subcontinent as if India and Pakistan were basic equals. Now it would be absurd to do that. India has outgrown Pakistan. The Republic of Korea has outgrown North Korea in that same sense. Now, in security terms, India cannot ignore Pakistan. It is to a great extent strategically pinned by Pakistan, and the same consideration applies to the Republic of Korea and the DPRK. But that does not mean that that the Republic of Korea is not a global player. It is, and therefore Korean studies has to treat Korea as a global player. So that's the primary point that I would make. And just with regard to the liberal global order, the ultimate underpinning of the liberal global order has been American military, particularly maritime power. And as long as that military and maritime power remains in place, the United States is meeting its most important responsibility in upholding that order. And while the Trump administration has taken some concrete steps away from liberal internationalism, it is unclear to me how far it is going to go. What is not unclear to me is how far I am going to go, which is here.
Well, I'll try and keep it to 10 minutes as well, or less. Since there was some audience polling done earlier, let me do my own audience poll. How many people here believe in reincarnation? I don't see anyone. Well, there's a fellow named Lester Brown at the World Watch Institute, and I'd swear he's the reincarnation of Thomas Malthus, because he has written extensively over a number of years about scarcity of food and population growth and population being a burden. Some time back, Nick took him on in a sense, and he wrote about population being a resource, a very important resource and not a burden. And now he's writing about South Korea and the silvering of that country. And so here we have an economic resource that's in decline. And so what do you do about it? If you're a business, what do you do when you have a critical input like that? Well, you might practice capital deepening, right? And capital deepening means building up your human capital. And what Nick has shown is Korea's tremendous investment in human capital as a partial solution to this problem it has with an aging society. Older people, I'm speculating now, of course, consume differently than younger people. They have a total, their whole spending package on entertainment, shelter, food, and so forth is quite different. And of course, their health expenditures go up significantly, and a lot of that is being pushed off into the public sectors in a number of the advanced economies. So all of that is going to change. Does South Korea have other options to change its demographic future? I mean, the two that come to mind very quickly are immigration, and South Korea has never shown itself to be very hospitable to having a surge in expats, and the other is unification. But unification, while it would bring a lot of younger people, would also bring in undereducated, probably a number of physically challenged people. It would be bringing in a lot of structural challenges that would be competing against expenditure on other things in the South at a time when these choices will be very, very difficult. So the fact that South Korea has options to do foreign investment, to build up its wealth, I think I'm not looking at dire prospects. I'm looking, as Bill Brown said, at the possibility of adaptability as the pricing of these resources shift and create new opportunities. So anyway, I really welcome Nick for giving us the longer perspective. In terms of THAAD, I don't understand it either. I don't understand China's aggressive response to THAAD. When Troy was discussing this, he thought perhaps it was a reaction to China's excessive expectations. I've always thought of China playing the long game, the slow and patient game, not necessarily having excessive expectations for rapid change in the short term. So that doesn't really resonate with me very much. So what else might it be? Well, one thing that was missing from the paper was a little history about interactions between China and South Korea. We can go back to around 2000 and look at the Garlic War and the excessive penalties that China imposed on the North, and like in terms of suspending the sales of cell phones and so forth, in reaction to South Korea upping the tariff very markedly on garlic. Now, South Korea may have jumped the gun on that, but they certainly saw the threat clearly, because talk to the garlic growers in California about the problem of Chinese garlic, or go to Europe and talk to them as well, because Chinese garlic has undercut markets globally. So we could go down a few years. We could talk about, let's call it the kimchi conflict, right? So that's sort of the same thing. We have China imposing excessive penalties on something that could be handled at a more reasonable, negotiable level. So what is China doing in these instances and in the current one with that? Well, let me speculate, since everybody else is. Maybe they're sending a message to everybody. And so South Korea happens to be the recipient of this message, but it's the same message they sent to the Philippines. It's the same message I think they probably sent to Greece, since it just made a vote that saved China some problems. So that means South Korea right now is on the spot. Right? How it responds to China can actually set the tone for future issues. If South Korea caves now, what is it going to mean the next time a conflict comes up and China applies enormous pressure? So I think how this gets settled is vitally important. And the fact that they're able to do these measures, I think, validates the fact that China should not, well, the notion, not the fact, the notion that China should not be considered a market economy in terms of the WTO, because market economies can't exercise that kind of clout over their companies and citizenry. So as I say, I think this is extraordinarily important. North Korea wasn't mentioned. I think it's important to mention North Korea. How would the North Koreans respond to a challenge like this by China? Historically, when North Korea had an economic dispute with the Soviet Union or with China, they would settle them. North Korea used to capture Chinese rail cars. And then the Chinese would stop delivering something, they'd negotiate, some of the rail cars get returned, everything would be fine. When the Soviet Union pressured North Korea about Afghanistan and some of the other issues, the North Koreans would not negotiate, because that was a political decision, a political conflict, and not one that was economic. North Korea is not a shrimp, it's not a porpoise, it's a hedgehog. And so it puts up its defenses, and it is very, very stubborn. So if China tried this with the North, they would get no traction whatsoever. But on economics, they would. And then finally on TPP, and unfortunately this will have to be brief, I too would wonder what TPP is all about, since all we hear about is TPP itself, and not the terms. You know, and Bill Brown is correct on about everything except PRC military sales to North Korea. Because there were some trucks that were made into Tels. But anyway, what is a regional trade agreement? It's nothing but a series of bilateral negotiations that other regional partners are forced to accept, right? So I'm not terribly concerned about the presumed death of the liberal economic order yet. I mean, it's only been a few months. I don't think it's time to be tossing dirt in the grave. So thank you all very much.
Oh, I'll take my position back on the table, and we've got plenty of time for questions from the audience. In the back, standing up. Yeah. Yeah, wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. Excellent discussions. My question is going to be for Troy, as he might expect. George Hutchinson. I'm affiliated with George Mason University as a consultant. I do some work with 7th Air Force and USFK advising on military installation encroachment related issues. So on the periphery of the THAAD issue, and just a couple of quick points, and then I'll get to my question. I'll try and be brief. But so THAAD, you know, time goes by and the news forgets, but THAAD has really been a requirement that successive USFK commanders have been requesting most earnestly since about 2011. And these negotiations, even though officially the ROC would say that we're not talking about this officially, of course they were talking about it officially at lower levels. So at about the time that it was established that there was indeed a threatening enough to exceed excessive delays in negotiating, and under the Park Geun-hye administration, when the idea was made, when the agreement was made to bring THAAD in, it was well known that it would be a battery. A battery was the agreement. The agreement was for a battery. And the subset of that was, it was well known that in a battery there are 6 launchers in order for it to be an effective operational system. So with that known, the site was selected, that agreement was made, and the first site that was selected was not the famous golf course, the Sungju golf course. It was a former ROC Air Force Hawk missile site with a sizable population in a city called Kimcheon. So there was an uproar there, and a decision was made. A very small EIS, or environmental impact study, was done, and a decision was made to move it to a location that was just as suitable, but away from any sizable population. So I just make those 3 points because sometimes that doesn't get mentioned. But with that said, and with Moon Jae-in's reaction, being shocked that there was actually 6 launchers in this battery, and that a full-blown economic impact statement would have to take place, that would take place probably over a 12-month to an 18-month period. Acquiescing now to China, do you see, Troy, has he set a precedent now that any time the ROC gets a little bit out of line, that China's going to come swinging with the economic hammer?
Yeah, I mean, this is the interesting and the difficult question you have. You may know this better because of your background than I do, but I'm actually on the environmental study side somewhat confused because some stories have said that the area was only something like 100 square acres or something, and then others have said it was larger. And if it was the smaller size that it's on, it doesn't need the longer environmental review, which then raises a question of why the review is taking place. But I haven't found consistent reporting, so I can't speak to that. But I think the challenge becomes, I think like any good politician, the hope here is that, this is the way you take and you draw the poison out of the issue, if you will. You do the review, you say the process is done fine, and then you move forward, everybody can be happy. But the problem is, and this was in the paper the other day, I think the Chinese have played this well. They apparently told their South Korean counterparts in, I think, their defense ministry meetings, that they expect South Korea to quickly make the right political decision on this issue and to honor their word to China. So, in essence, it doesn't seem as though Beijing is taking the perspective of, you know what, all right, you're going to do the environmental study, let's all save face here, we'll see what happens in like 12 months and then we can figure this out. They're pushing for a quick answer as well, it looks like. And so now the situation you have is that, South Korea is in the position of, well, if you quickly make a decision, having told the U.S. you have to do an environmental review, and then you just decide to pull the batteries out, you've clearly caved to China, and that will send the signal that in the future, all right, if you pressure us, we can do, we'll cave. And one of the things, and I mean, just to touch on Bill's question of so what, I mean, there's different ways I can answer this, but in the context of your question, the so what would be is what I was trying to show is that while yes, there has been some steps to economically pressure South Korea, it's not necessarily been as much as people may think. And so therefore, if at the end of the day, trade is going up, but a few key industries are being hit, that seems to me that a cost that you can take and bear. And so the question is do you bear a small cost for your national security, knowing perhaps China tries to pull up the pressure, but as I noted in terms of the investment and then was noted later on, you do buy a bill and, Foxconn, there are other recourses that, South Korea could take. So, how much of a real tit for tat does Beijing want to get into? Because, the South Korean economy may be significantly smaller than the Chinese economy, but in terms of the trade they do with each other, they're both very important. So, I mean, this isn't sort of like China and the Philippines in the sense of that, all the leverage is really maybe on one side. And so, but the problem is, if you take and look at this the other way, you now have the pressure on the U.S. side, because now you have this environmental study. We, to our understanding, thought the process was done correctly. And so the question is, even let's say that, Moon Jae-in and the South Korean government are right, the study wasn't done, it should have been done, we have to do it and everything. And, you should, because everything needs to be done properly because you don't want people challenging it later. But you never know where this leads to as well. What if they come back with an unexpected result or something? Or what if after the study comes out, because there's also been discussion of the National Assembly being brought into it. The National Assembly says, well, you know what, we know that it's environmentally fine, we've had the tech briefings, we understand, but we just don't want to do this. So you open up, more problems. So in some ways, I understand from a political perspective why he's trying to do it, but I think they're now maybe a more difficult spot.
More questions. Young lady in the black dress.
Oh, great. I actually have a question for you. Oh, hello. Excuse me. I believe you touched on this briefly in your presentation, but I wanted to get a more deep understanding about the effects that you think demographics will play on reunification, potentially if it happens. For instance, when German reunification happened, I think the population of East Germany was about 1/4 that of West Germany, and their economy was about 10 times smaller. However, as you stated, like the population difference between North and South Korea is getting smaller and smaller every day, and the economic growth that South Korea has had in the past has caused their economy, I think it's 40 times larger was the statistic that I read recently. So how do you think, what kind of policies do you think South Korea could potentially use maybe to demographically approach this problem to reduce the burden that would be placed on its citizens if reunification were to occur?
Well, yeah, Germany is the nearest analogy that we have, and with every passing year, it's a less perfect analogy because, as you indicated, there was a big difference in population between Western and Eastern Germany. And there also was a gap in skills and health between the two sides, but nothing like what we imagine exists with North Korea. I myself am a little bit skeptical about the officially released population numbers from North Korea because they're just funny things in those reports that would most easily be explained by wholesale official falsification. But I can't, that's Occam's razor. Occam's razor isn't always right, and I can't prove what I was just mentioning to you. But as a generalization, we'd have to assume on the trajectory of the past generation that the gap between the two sides is going to get bigger in the future rather than smaller. There'd have to be some very major change in North Korea for us to see some sort of convergence between North and South. That being the case, how does one prepare for this? Well, I think it's still possible to make the argument that a Korean reunification could be pursued, in the sort of a classical sense of like a project. You could look at it as a long-term project. Some projects pay for themselves, and projects that pay for themselves have to generate a high rate of return. So how do you generate a high rate of return in a unified Korean peninsula? You probably have to have a pretty good business environment. You probably have to have good policies and institutions and rule of law. There are things that you're going to have to, if it is a constitutional democracy under which this occurs, there are all sorts of things that our friends at George Mason University have told us to prepare for a long time, and we'll have agent principle problems and all sorts of things like that. But at the probably the most important thing that could be done in the now would be for people in the outside world to start thinking about human resources in North Korea and the cultivation of human resources in North Korea. That's easier said than done with a government that has a Songbun system which is indifferent to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in the hostile or complex classes. This will this will be unsatisfying to say, but the first step towards anything like this would be getting transparency in North Korea about its human situation. I mean, many years ago at KEI, Greg Scarlatu, then at KEI, had a project on human security in North Korea. And that's exactly the sort of stuff which the outside world needs to pay attention to. And by the way, as long as people in the outside world are providing food assistance or other sorts of humanitarian assistance to the DPRK, maybe they could be brave enough to ask for human information sometime.
Yeah, I just like to add I always, when I look at the two countries, I see enormous, like you say, enormous gaps. But another way to put it is complementarities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I see the North Korean and South Korean economies increasingly complementary. By that I mean there's going to be a lot of professors in South Korea looking for jobs. A lot of school teachers already are. North Korea is a great environment, assuming a good unification takes place, for teaching to happen. Similarly, South Korea is going to be in dire need of steel workers, car workers. There's plenty of those in North Korea. So the complementarity is really what drives tremendous economic growth. So I would see coming together there a really positive environment because of the gaps.
Tara.
So I have another question related to economy, but before that, very quickly, I share your frustration about that. I can get really riled about this because it has been framed in South Korea in every way: environment, health, sovereignty issue, everything except security. So that is a bit frustrating. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about something more pleasant, like economy. Your last comment during the presentation was South Korea is in pretty good shape, so don't change anything. With the current Moon administration, there are several changes he already announced, or it's already in the works. One is before the election, he announced that he will create 850,000 jobs, which is good, but it's all going to be in the government sector. That's not quite a million, but that's quite a lot. And that's something that didn't exist. It's just going to be created. And he guaranteed the majority will be created by the end of this year. The other is energy. Basically, he ordered shutdown of all the coal power plants, and recently nuclear power plants. Basically, they won't be renewed, so that will be, I guess, phased out. I try to look for what percentage of energy that is for that meets South Korea's demand, and I couldn't really find one very, very quickly. But this is what I came up with. If you combine the nuclear energy, and South Korea is 5th largest producer in the world, so nuclear energy, coal, and oil, that's about 85% of energy demand in South Korea. So doing something like this without having a replacement strategy, what does it mean for the economy? But anyway, that's another change. And one more change that I'd like to mention is there's cutting-edge defense technology in South Korea that are leaving in South Korea because of poor environment for operations. And that's because a lot of the defense industries, which have a lot of high tech, they are seen as corrupt. Every firm is seen as corrupt. So maybe there might be corruption, but not everyone. But when you have CEOs that are involved in years and years and years of investigation, and that's where their focus is, it's hard to focus on operations. So I'm just wondering, given these changes or trends, married with your demographic trends, and I love those graphs, by the way. What can you say about this? So that's my question.
Thank you very much. Under the remarkable growth in wealth that I tried to illustrate there by stealing some charts from Credit Suisse was it's their estimates, not mine. Took place between the year 2000 and 2016, and so we have to remember that almost half of that period under consideration was Sunshine Policy era, And of course, DJ and Nomu Hyun were different from one another, and I'd expect that President Moon Jae-in is going to be different as well from the previous two Sunshine eras. But I guess my point would be that it's possible to do a lot of little things wrong as long as you do one big thing right. And if you look at South Korea during the military era, I wrote a whole book about this once. It's just so many what I would regard as economic policy errors just on top of each other. But what South Korea got right at that time was the orientation towards the global economy, the export orientation. And getting that one thing right made up for a host of other sins. I think that we may have the same sort of situation going on now. There are always populist policy temptations. Democratic policies in open societies are always like that. But as long as there is the human capital deepening that Bill Newcomb mentioned, the improvements in health, the unlocking the value of aging, other things like that, those are big things. And if you do some of the big things right, even if you do a dozen infuriating other things wrong, you're going to come out ahead.
Right in the middle with the beard.
John Burton with the Korea Times. I have two questions. One for Troy to begin with. There was a view last year when Park Geun-hye agreed to THAAD after discussions for the last 3 or 4 years in Korea, that she was using it as a pressure tactic to persuade Beijing to increase sanctions against North Korea. And of course, Beijing said, how dare you, and put her down as a result. Do you agree with that interpretation? And my second question is, do you think that China will use the Belt and Road Initiative in some ways to stabilize conditions on the Korean Peninsula? And that question is open to everybody.
Good question.
Well, you want to take the One Belt, One Road since you...
Sure, if you want to do that one first.
Okay.
So right now, Korea doesn't feature at all in the Belt and Road Initiative. What I was outlaying was sort of a possibility based on what I perceived geopolitical shifts to be. That said, it could try to do something like that if it perceives perceives a U.S. Acceptance of the AIIB. If the U.S. were to join AIIB and were to get more involved and would be more open to Korea joining, it would. And if it was to be joined through a sea route versus a land route, I think the land route is a much different scenario, one that would create a lot more contention for the U.S. and South Korea, considering that it would have to go eventually through North Korea. The past 4 presidents have all had major Central Asia policies, initiatives, but none of them have worked because of the North Korea issue and the geographic constraints that North Korea presents. That said, if there might be some sort of a change within the acceptance of the administration to be more open to engagement and China willing to throw more money at the One Belt One Road initiative on the Korean Peninsula, which would, I guess, it would help South Korea in a number of ways to meet its energy needs, but at the same time, it would put a great strain on the U.S. South Korea relationship. So there could be some benefits, but there would also be some very drastic consequences.
So on the question of whether THAAD was leverage or sincere, I guess, I look back at that period and, there's sort of a sharp shift in South Korean policy. On the one hand, I think, China's pressure points probably are more on the military side as opposed to the economic, and I think that's something that we need to take into a broader consideration. But I think ultimately, if the goal, and I should also caveat this with that, there has significantly been a suggestion on both the U.S. and the Korean side that, if the North Korean missile threat went away, that, THAAD would not be necessary. The question becomes, is that said because we're trying to assuage Beijing's concerns and let them know that this isn't a permanent thing, and also nudge, nudge, please help us? Or was it explicit that? I think it's probably the first, a combination of the both, a little bit of a nudge, but a sincere that we need this, but that if that changes, that it won't be here. And so I think that's probably more the broader perspective on this.
Fourth row back in the middle.
A very good friend of mine has written a book in 2012 called Unification is Bonanza, and President Park Geun-hye took it up on January 2014, and since then it changed the dialogue on unification a lot. In South Korea proper, it is one of the leading school of thought on unification, especially it's tied to economy. He's an economist, and it's now translated into Japanese and English. One of the arguments he makes is what Bill Brown talks about, this demographic, the complementarity is important factor. Rich mineral underground resource of North Korea is another factor, and many others as well. But overall, once Korea is united, general notion is money will travel north, from south to north, in search of profit. People will move from north to south in search of better life. And how much money will go north, how many people will come south, in some kind of mathematical equation there. So what are some comments you can make on that dynamics of people and money and demographics? You talked about birth rates, death rates, and so on, but not so much about migration. The other thing is that he talks about unification will not just necessarily be a bonanza, like a throw of a dice. It will take 4 major conditions. If only they are met, then there will be bonanza. I will just briefly refer to these 4 and seek your comment on it. The first is once Korea is united, South Korea and North Korea would be, for about 10-year period, would be subject to 2 separate economic zones, avoiding mostly the mistakes the the Germans made about equating Deutsche Mark's values and wages and so on. The second is military spending will be going down from 3% to 1%, considerable savings from that, because we will no longer need a very heavy military expenditure. The third is most perhaps troublesome, and especially seeking a comment. He proposes that Buy Korea policy. He talks about how America often referred to, especially when in economically dire situation, referred to Buy America, America first. In Korea, this is a time for Korea to do that. Korea first, and Korean investment from south to north should get the sort of lion's share, if not exclusive share, of investment in North Korea, because so the money can stay in the peninsula. The fourth is perhaps not so important here, about what to do with the real estate. It's a limited country and a lot of people there. So he talks about how, unlike what Germans did, Helmut Kohl did, instead of allowing South Koreans to claim the land they left behind, they are going to be given a token of a promissory note that you will get something back for the land you lost, but not now, and not in terms of in-kind return, but you'll be given some money, which you will not get none of it if the Korea is not united. So that it will take some time, and actually, sometime in the future, real estate perhaps will be for the entire peninsula, might one day become nationalized, and people will no longer own the land, but rent the land, sort of thing. What are some of your comments on any of this?
I have a comment. You want to go first? Oh.
Yeah. Well, I'll just be really brief. So on your 4 conditions, like the first one you laid out, the separate zones and avoiding the mistakes of Germany. I think there's 2 ways to look at this, and we need to be careful here. I'm Italian American, and I've read a lot about like Roman history, about Italian history and everything, and I still have family there. I know them. The one thing that always strikes me is there's this constant question now that Italy's 150th birthday was only about a year or 2 ago, and there was great question of whether they should celebrate. There's a question of whether the country should separate, and what I think we need to keep in mind is there are economic decisions and what's best economically, and then there's political decisions, what's best politically. And I think whatever decisions, when unification comes, Korea makes, they need to be made on what will ensure the long-term political viability of the state. And the reason I say that is because if you have separate economic zones, and if North Koreans come to see themselves as second-class citizens, there's already concerns about this in the same country, then the state will not survive politically. And so, and I wish I could find this because I'm fairly certain Helmut Kohl said this. The reason he did what he did was that he could not ask East Germans to be second-class citizens of their own country. So I think that the idea, I know this gets tossed out a lot, mathematically it may look nice, but we don't live in a mathematical world, and that politically it's going to be very difficult to do that. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Sir, I thought you outlined that stuff absolutely beautifully and outlined all the analytical issues. In the interest of time, I'll just make one or 2 points on that. The first is the whole question about why did Helmut Kohl do anything as economically idiotic as the one-for-one currency conversion and the wage policy, and the reason that he made those decisions which flew in the face of Economics 101 first introductory lecture, was because he was the chancellor, as Troy said, of a democracy, of a constitutional democracy, and the one-for-one conversion and the unrealistic wage increases in Eastern Germany were his democracy's way of making sure that Dusseldorf and Duisburg didn't have shanty towns of hundreds of thousands of penniless East Germans looking for work and improving their lives there. There's going to be an analogous question for the political situation in the ROK. Even with all of the improvements that Bill Brown correctly indicated that would come from unification, the skills gap, the growing skills gap between the two populations can only mean there's going to be an income distribution that's going to make the island of Manhattan look like Sweden. And so there's going to be a question in a democratic society about what role transfer payments will take, and transfer payments will not facilitate these adjustments. They will probably slow them down. But we're also, I guess we also should recognize that we're talking about a best of all possible worlds unification, a peaceful, voluntary reunification in a world that hasn't been shattered by some unimaginable events. I wrote a book 20 years ago arguing about the economic advantages of reunification, and I don't think that there's anything that's happened that has changed those arguments. The thing which I think we do have to pay attention to is the growing gap in human skills between North and South Korea is going to make for a much more economically polarized society. And since human beings are also political animals as well as economic animals, this is going to have to be worked out some way in democratic politics.
Yeah, let me just say I have read that book. In fact, you gave it to me, and I like it quite a lot. I would sort of just say a couple things. One is, I think the way to think of it is granularity. The market economies on both sides can integrate nicely. An authoritarian country on one and a market on cannot do that. So we can't imagine that happening right now. But as North Korea hopefully continues to marketize, that starts becoming a real reality. I agree with the problem of the different sectors, but if you think of that as the two sectors before unification, political unification happens, in other words, North Korea starts becoming that second sector, that second block, using a dollar as they do now, a dollarized economy. The huge advantage that country has is, we don't like it, but the state owns all the property. As it marketizes, like China's been doing, it can sell off that property and bolster its own people's livelihoods. That's what I could see happening. Hopefully, it's a very optimistic scenario. But that, to me, is the bonanza, and I thought Park Geun-hye was quite appropriate in talking about it like that.
Well, this panel is out of time, but we are very glad you all came. Very stimulating questions from the audience and very, very stimulating presentations and discussions.